let's get started. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the prescription you were handed. In optometry, prescriptions are precise. They're measured carefully against the anatomy of your eye, completely unique to you. No patient's two eyes are exactly the same. Imagine handing a child a pair of glasses and saying, "These were mine. They should work for you too." It would make no sense. And yet, psychologically, that is exactly what happens. These lenses we inherit are formed very, very early, often before we even have words. So let's talk for a minute about where they come from. The lenses that you wear, and again, we're talking about these metaphorical lenses, are coming from and created by the emotional climate of the home we grew up in. So imagine you're sitting there as a child under the age of 6, and there is a climate in the home. There are prevalent emotions, there are prevalent fears, prevalent thoughts, and all of these things are coming together and creating the lens that you wear and the way you see everything. The fears and insecurity of the caregivers are definitely a major part of your lenses. And on top of that, what's going on in your home, the cultural expectations about who we should be are also informed at that very young age. And that's another way that our lens is influenced. So because we were children, we didn't evaluate these messages. They were absorbed and written on the lens that over time, those early impressions become the lens through which we see everything, including ourselves. Let's talk for a minute about the science of early lenses. Developmental psychologists call this our internal working model. Researchers like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth showed that our earliest relationships form a blueprint for how we understand ourselves, love, safety, and belonging. And the important part is we didn't choose that blueprint, once again. This is just what we inherited. It formed before we had the ability to even question it, which means many of us are still living by a prescription written before we even understood what it was. And because we've worn it so long, we've stopped noticing it. We don't think, "I'm seeing through a filter." We just think, this is just how things are. So how is that settling in for you? Can you relate to this idea that the way your primary caregivers felt, the fears they carried, the emotions that were most commonly running through them were filling the space that you were, and it actually became the atmosphere that you lived in, and no guidance from anyone, just as a matter of fact, that atmosphere became the lens that you took on and see everything through. So I know for me, I can really relate to this. I think it's pretty fascinating, actually. I want to talk for a moment about my own inherited lens. Well, my parents were extremely young when they got married. They were 20 and 21. And my father struggled with addiction and eventually left when I was 2. So my mom was suddenly raising a child alone at the age of 21. And she was in enormous pain for many other reasons too, from her own childhood and her own lens that she'd been wearing, and just insurmountable pain. And even though I was just a toddler, I absorbed that emotional atmosphere. And what it was for me at that time and what was for our family, there was so much fear. There was a lot of instability because it was a lot for her. And because at the time I was so little, but I saw the struggling happening, and I took on more responsibility, thinking somehow that I needed to keep things together, which sounds absurd for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, but it's true. It was influenced by how I perceived the situation at such a young age. And that's exactly what happened. Also, in my lens, I realized that my emotions probably weren't welcome because there's just so many other emotions that were bigger than mine. And I could see them and I knew they were there. And I just made a decision that my emotions were not going to be as important. And it was mainly because my mom was so overwhelmed with her own grief. And that was all that our home could handle. So the lenses I carried through that into my life had a lot of different layers, but one was that this world is unstable, that it is built on fear. There's so much fear that I have to fix and manage things. Other people's emotions are my responsibility, that my feelings are secondary, that I shouldn't really need very much because that's how I was able to survive. And the interesting thing about inheriting a lens, it has all these layers to it, is we don't even really know we're wearing them until something happens. So they're there and they show up in different ways, but we've learned to acclimate to them, to compensate for them. So until something big happens, we don't really understand. I don't think I didn't really understand the impact that they would have. And before we move on to my experience, the story about the lens revealing itself to me and me having the opportunity to change it, I just want to say there are some people out there listening who had a lot of very different experiences where they grew up in an atmosphere where people believed in miracles and that wonderful things happen, and you can count on love and you can count on relationships lasting. And there's this very deep feeling of stability and predictability and security. So it's so vastly different. I mean, so many people, everyone has their own lens, just the same way in optometry, everyone has their own prescription. Everyone has their own lens we're talking about here in this work, this inner lens that's so incredibly unique to their experience growing up. So back to me, I want to share a little bit about how my lens revealed itself. The moment it became visible to me for the first time, like crystal clear, is when I got divorced. So going back when I was 30, I had just had my daughter, one daughter, and I knew something was not going right in the marriage. And I ended up getting divorced when I was around 31. I got separated and moved away when my daughter was 5 months old. So I was, 30, and then went through the divorce when I was 31. And at the time, imagine how overwhelming that was. My whole life was unraveling. And in the middle of all of that, I started noticing something. There was a part of me that wasn't entirely surprised by this, because in some ways, the idea of divorce felt familiar. It was in my lens. I had experienced divorce as a child. And so because of that, I could see how that blueprint for my parents' divorce had shaped my expectations. And I had never thought about that before then, really how deep that was. But I remember making that realization looking back in my relationships prior to being married. And I knew then that I always carried that belief inside, and it had impacted all of my relationships, not just the marriage. But I didn't really believe that it was possible to be in a very happy, stable, secure marriage, because my parents divorced when I was so young. And I could see right then and there how that blueprint had shaped all my expectations very subconsciously. And that realization was painful, thinking, oh my gosh. And I actually felt a lot of grief for myself that I had been carrying that belief for so long. And at the same time, though, it was very freeing because I realized I didn't write this prescription. And because I didn't write it, it was just there from my experiences. There was a gap, and I realized I can actually change it. I can write a new one. I have capability that I didn't realize I had. So even though it was this horrible experience, it was also a turning point to realize this is the lens I've been wearing. I want to talk for a minute too about what the wrong prescription does. In optometry, wearing the wrong prescription isn't just blurry vision, it's exhausting because you're constantly compensating, trying to correct for it. People get headaches, their eyes are straining, they want to avoid detailed work. And emotionally, the same thing happens. So when we live through that inherited lens, we can experience emotional consequences. So one would be chronic self-doubt. And that's not because we lack the wisdom, but it's really just because we're never taught to trust ourselves. We don't believe that we can trust ourselves. This chronic self-doubt. The next one is people pleasing, because we learned our worth has to be earned. When there is low self-worth, the feeling of I have to earn it by taking care of other people, that's all a variation of people pleasing. And then we might even have a fear of visibility, because maybe at one point our feelings were exposed and they were rejected. So we're afraid to fully be visible. And another one is imposter syndrome, because it feels like success, even if you have enormous success, it doesn't land because our internal lens says we don't belong there. It hasn't caught up with where we are in our adult life. There's a part of us that thinks, I don't belong here. And many of the struggles women bring into coaching are not personality flaws. They are prescriptions that were never written for them in the first place. And they're butting up against it now. And so now they're realizing, where is this coming from? This is really blocking me. I need to change this prescription. Now I'm going to talk about the inner exam, which is what I refer to often as the new lens method. So I talked about earlier is the optometric exam, which is in the exam room with a 1 or 2. So the new lens method is the same idea, but it does the work internally. So instead of testing eyesight, we examine the beliefs shaping how you see yourself. So just noticing the beliefs you're currently living with, because that's a big part of the new lens method. What are you seeing through? How are you seeing your self-worth? How are you seeing the possibilities that are in front of you? Do you see them as actualizing, or do you see them as they're never going to happen? So what are the beliefs you're carrying? Identifying where those beliefs came from. This is very helpful, because then you can put kind of some structure to it. It's not just free-flowing beliefs. You can look at it and see, okay, that makes sense why I had that belief, because I lived that experience when I was 2. And that's why I didn't think it was unheard of for me to get divorced one day. Another one is testing whether they still serve you. So now again, creating that gap between ourselves and the lens, saying, does this belief serve me? And really question that, get clear on that. And then also is writing a truer lens moving forward. So what is in alignment with who you are, your unique self, not the lens that was just given to you by family, anyone that's a caregiver in your life under the age of 6, looking at that and saying, that is not mine, and what is true for me. And it's aligned with who you really are. And that's the lens we integrate and work with in this work. So now I'm going to ask you 5 questions I want you to think about. And if you have a pen and paper, just jot down what comes to your mind first. The first question is, what do you believe about your own worth when things get hard? Number 2, where did that belief come from? Number 3, what has believing that cost you? Number 4, is that prescription written for the woman you are today or for someone you've already outgrown? Number 5, if you were given the right prescription now, what would it say? And you don't have to fully believe it yet. Just let the possibility exist, is all. There's a moment in the exam room when the right lens finally drops into place. And people often say the same thing. I didn't know I could see like that. What's beautiful is that nothing about their eyes changed in that moment. They simply stopped trying to see the world through the wrong prescription. I believe the same shift is possible in our lives. And sometimes the first step isn't changing anything. It's simply realizing the lens you've been seeing through was never actually yours. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated, a question, a sentence, a moment of recognition, I'd love to hear from you. You can always reach me at trisharosestone.com, and I genuinely read every message. You'll also find the 5 reflection questions from today's episode in the show notes. And if Her New Lens has meant something to you, the kindest thing you can do is share it with a woman in your life who might need it too. Until next time, keep seeing your life through a new lens. Bye for now.